Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Mary Alice Haddad. I'm the John E. Andrus Professor of Government at Wesleyan University, and I'm here to introduce our great speaker, Charles Crabtree, who has started as an assistant. I'm sorry. My one job. I have one job. We'll start again. That's so funny. Only not really. Sorry. Sorry, Charles.
No.
Charles McClean, who's at Yale, I have that right. Started at Yale University. And he studies a wide range of things, many of which are very, very current in our own political life in this country and also in Japan. He's giving a presentation on silver democracy today. He works on age and politics and comparative politics in advanced democracies, how social welfare programs are affected by the age of politicians, and a wide range of other things. He has long roots in the area. He got his BA at Tufts, his MA at Regional Studies here at Harvard, was in the program, and has also taught got his PhD at San Diego, and has taught at Yale, and is now back to speak with us today. He's published in a wide range of journals: the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Nature, Medicine, Political Behavior, Political Psychology, and a range of other things. And his paper, The Element of Surprise, Election Timing, and Opposition Preparedness, won the Best Paper Award in the APSA Elections Public Opinion and Voting Behavioral section in 2022. So as he just stayed up all night watching all the Japanese elections, as probably some of you in the audience have. So please welcome Charles.
Thanks, really excited to be here, to be back at Harvard in person. I did my postdoc, but it was during COVID, and so I did it entirely from San Diego. So it's great to be back in this room. I think for the first time, Shin and I were talking for maybe 12 or 13 years since I was a master's student. So really happy to be here today talking about silver democracy. So in many countries, politicians are often significantly older than the average constituent they represent. So we might think about here in the US, Joe Biden, the oldest president in US history. If Trump somehow manages to win and serves 4 years, he may surpass that record. We might also think about Japan. Fumio Kishida resigned this year to be replaced by the couple months older Shigeru Ishiba. We'll see how long Ishiba stays in office. And Ishiba, even in this moment last night, we could talk about the election, right? When maybe Japanese voters are sort of clamoring for reform, went into the election where the average age of his cabinet members was 64, and nobody in the cabinet was under 50 years old. So for those of us who follow US politics or Japanese politics, this type of phenomenon might just seem like really natural. Isn't this just how politics are done? Right? Don't we just sort of want politicians to have more experience? Isn't it rare everywhere for young people to serve in office? And while it's true that young people are underrepresented in political institutions across the globe, it turns out that they're especially underrepresented here and in Japan. So what I'm showing you here are all of the OECD countries, and the y-axis is the percent of members in the lower or unicameral chamber who are under 40 years old. So I haven't updated this with yesterday, but I did look it up. It was 5%, and today it's 6%. So progress, 20% increase. But still, Japan only ahead of South Korea. Very, very few young people in office. On the other end of the spectrum, Nordic countries and many countries in Europe often have more than a third of members, sometimes more than 40% of members under 40. And so in my work, I think both about how do we explain this variation and whether it matters. Does it matter for public policy, for democracy? There's many issues that are important to young people, issues like childcare, education, unemployment. Young people also stand to be disproportionately affected by longer-term challenges like declining birth rates and climate change. And so without more young people in public office, there's at least a concern that the policies enacted by mostly older politicians could be detrimental to the interests of the young. And if we look just quickly at cross-national patterns, there's maybe some suggestive evidence this is the case. Now I'm showing you MPs under 40 on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the ratio of per capita social spending on the elderly compared to spending on children. So all countries in the OECD spend more per capita on the elderly than they do on children. So while the Nordic countries on one end of the spectrum spend about 3 to 4 times more on the elderly than they do on children, historically, Japan and the US have spent about 20 times more per capita on the elderly than they have on children. So in the book project, I'm interested in sort of 3 big questions. Why are younger politicians so rare in countries like Japan and countries like the US and not elsewhere? Does this matter for public policy? Do younger politicians, when given the chance, promote or enact fundamentally different policies important to young people more than older politicians? And also, what kind of consequences does youth underrepresentation have for democracy, for political participation, especially among young people, or maybe for public trust in institutions and democratic legitimacy? We'll talk about all 3, but today I'm going to really focus on the second point, consequences for social spending, and happy to talk more about the other 2 in the discussion. So in political science, we haven't really had a lot of work until very recently, thinking about whether the age of politicians matters. And the little work we have had very recently has mostly focused on causes rather than consequences. So sort of like, why don't young people have more political ambition? What types of institutions keep young people from getting interested in running for office? But there hasn't been much work about whether important consequences follow for, say, the direction of public policy, what I'm going to talk about today. And when I started this project, this was surprising because in political science, there's just such a wonderful breadth of literature on how a wide range of other characteristics, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, can all affect how politicians behave in office and the types of policies they promote and enact. So I started this by kind of asking, why is age missing in the conversation? And early on, I thought, well, there's a lot of things that are sort of different about age as a social identity. In a lot of this literature, the mechanism, the why, is often sort of like the unique experience that's associated, say, with being a woman or a racial and ethnic minority. And it's those unique experiences that shape the politician's behavior in office. But isn't age like the only universal identity, universally experienced, right? All older politicians have direct personal experience being young. It's also like a fleeting identity. Young politicians aren't young forever, right? And so it isn't clear that the same type of relationship should exist sort of between, say, the aged politicians and the policies they enact. I'll talk about why I think it is the case, but today I'm going to argue that I do expect that when given the chance, younger politicians are going to promote social spending that benefits young families with children compared to spending on the elderly. So this is the main part I'm focusing on today, that age does matter, that the age of elected officials is going to shape the types of policies they promote and enact in office. So again, when we think about the age of politicians in political science, sometimes this could often be connected to sort of questions about experience. And so in lots of studies in political science, for example, use years of experience as essentially a proxy for the quality of a politician. Higher quality politicians are those with more experience, or those who have previously been elected to office before. And so these raise questions about, well, maybe younger politicians, even if they have different ideas about what the direction of public policy should be, they're going to be less effective. It takes years in office to sort of learn how to get things done. So even if they have different ideas, we're not really going to observe, especially a difference, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, in actual spending, right? Actual changes to the budget. But what I focus on in my work is that, yes, younger politicians may come to office with less experience, but they have these other characteristics that may be valuable, other characteristics that may shape how they influence public policy. So yes, younger politicians have less experience, but they're also coming to office at a fundamentally different life stage, right? So younger politicians, for example, we're talking about child welfare for young families, they're much more likely to be raising young children themselves, right? They're dealing with issues in their personal lives, issues like long wait lists for public daycare, as I'll talk about in a minute, or say rising childcare costs. I think these could put these issues sort of at the forefront of their mind, give them greater information about how to tackle these issues, make younger politicians more likely to focus on policies important to young families with children. Young politicians may come to office with less experience, but they have longer time horizons. They have a longer expected sort of remaining period of their lifespan, maybe longer expected tenure in office. This may give them a greater stake in long-term challenges, right? Like declining birth rates, aging populations. It's going to be younger generations who bear much of the burden, right, for paying for these policies in the future. This might make younger politicians, care more about these issues, discount the future less, and be more willing to sort of invest in the long term. And lastly, younger politicians are closer in age to younger voters. And so it could be that perhaps younger politicians are going to find it really hard to win election by trying to win over older voters. And so they're going to face a sort of strategic incentive that they should really try to target young voters, appeal to young voters. And so even if they don't personally care about childcare policy, maybe they're going to be the only politicians who listen to young people in Japan. They're going to really focus on younger voters, and that's sort of why they'll pursue these policies. So just to give some hypotheses for sort of what I'm going to show you today. So the overall thing I'm going to look at is whether younger politicians, when given the opportunity, are more likely than older politicians to increase spending on child welfare, right, compared to elderly welfare. And then to sort of get a sense of these different mechanisms I talked about, I'm going to look at whether the effects are larger among younger politicians who have this recent experience where they're raising young children themselves, get at the sort of life stage idea. I'm going to look at whether younger politicians are especially more likely to invest in the long term, whether they don't just increase spending on children, but also sort of put money more towards longer term thinking, longer term investment. We'll talk about more in a minute. And then lastly, I want to see if sort of the actions of younger politicians is sort of dependent on how many young voters there are, right? That they're sort of more responsive to the youth constituency, or maybe the story is really a voter story. It's about younger voters sort of like compelling the mayor. And as you get more and more young voters, maybe only young mayors or young politicians pay attention to young people. We'll come back to this in a second. So I hope in this room, compared to my usual poli-sci talks, I don't have to convince you that Japan is a great case for studying this issue, but just to go through it, right, Japan is at the forefront of the global trend in population aging. All countries in the world are aging, all countries, right? Japan is the world's oldest. If we're talking about sort of the percent of the population now, I think it's 29% for age 65 and over. This is just showing in bright red that 65 and over category sort of projecting out into the future. The tan is the working age population, and the lighter color is children, right? So since the 1970s, the elderly population has quadrupled, while the youth population, the child population has fallen by half, right? And so as we're asking fewer and fewer workers to bear rising costs for a growing elderly population, there's been all sorts of talks about whether we're going to see like more intergenerational inequality or intergenerational conflict. Concerns that politicians are going to pay attention to this growing population of older voters who turn out to vote at much higher rates, who donate more to political campaigns. If any of you have ever been in like a Japanese election, setting, like talking to Koenkai people, for example, it's all older people who are really involved in elections in Japan. And so there's this concern that the issues important to young people, like childcare issues, are just going to be overlooked. This was a concern of one woman who went onto this online forum and basically talked about this problem that Japan has had in recent years about long wait lists for public daycare. So unlike here in the US, in Japan, most daycare is either run by municipal governments or it's heavily subsidized by municipal governments. But there's been problems where there's not enough supply. And so this working woman went onto this online forum and she said, I can't believe that even in one of the world's wealthiest democracies, I have to quit my job to care for my child. And she titled the post, Die Japan Die. I couldn't believe it. This is in Tokyo. The mayor of her district, if you didn't know who the person is, but then a mayor in Tokyo was asked about this, an older male mayor, and he said, it's up to women to stay home when children are young. And so this isn't an issue we should pay attention to. The issue got so much attention that it was even asked during parliamentary questions to the then prime minister. And the prime minister said, well, the problem with online blogs is that they're anonymous. And so we don't know if this person even exists. Public outcry was swift. And so we have people with children on their front, right, coming out with these signs. And for those who don't read Japanese, the most popular sign says, Boyfriend ochita no watashi da. Basically, I am one of the people who failed to get a daycare spot, right? Trying to show this is like a real problem that older politicians are not paying attention to. Younger politicians and younger mayors in particular saw this as an opportunity to sort of showcase their commitment to childcare policy. So this is a group of young, mostly male mayors in Japan, as most mayors in Japan are men, who just 2 months later are basically volunteering at a daycare center. I love this photo because the mayors are very much focused on sort of the cameras, but you can't really see here. And if you look at children, they're not having a great time. Right? But mayors in Japan are actually like this. This is what I'm going to focus on today. And in this book in general, I focus a lot on local politics. And one of the reasons I focus on mayors is because they have a significant discretion over actual spending that affects child welfare and elderly welfare. Over half of all social spending in Japan is actually administered by municipal governments. Other reason I'm focusing on mayors from a sort of a research design standpoint is that if I looked at the diet, the national diet and the effect of younger politicians, the challenge is younger politicians tend to be so-called backbenchers. They don't have much influence necessarily over the direction of public policy, but in an executive office, in the mayor's office, where it's up to the mayor to sort of formulate the budget, at least in theory, both younger and older politicians could have a similar capacity to influence the direction of social spending. A little bit more detail just quickly about mayors in Japan. So mayors in Japan are elected to 4-year terms with no term limits. Unlike at the national level, and we could talk about yesterday's election, where it's a lot of party politics, almost every mayor in Japan runs for office officially as an independent. So they are absolutely have ties to the LDP. We could talk about it, but on like their campaign posters and when they're campaigning, they don't run on sort of a party label. They have a little bit less influence from parties in terms of their policy platform. And then 98% of mayors are men. So when I'm talking about today, we're not going to be able to do sort of like interactions between age and gender. I'm going to be looking at age differences within men in Japan, within male mayors. So although mayors are this great place for studying this question, the challenge to date has been that it's really hard to get data on local elections in any country in comparative politics, but especially in Japan. And so the big part of my book project too has been to build this so-called Japan municipal elections data set by basically doing a lot of web scraping of a variety of sites where individual voters can kind of go online and fill out information about the election in their area. The sites also sort of scrape newspapers as well, and I scrape newspapers as well. So this is just one example from that previous mayor. And basically I do this thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And I've done this for years. And I have a team of RAs that help me fill out the gaps. So after doing this for years, I'm really happy and I'm starting to share the data, so please talk to me. I have basically every candidate who ran for a local office over the last 25 years or so for municipal assembly or mayor. So over 200,000 candidates and more than 20,000 elections. I have their names, their age, their gender, their incumbency. Partisanship is tough because party is difficult at local levels, but I have turnout as well. So again, happy to talk to people who are interested in doing projects on gender or incumbency effects, or how come so many local elections go uncontested. But today we're going to talk about age. So let's just take a quick look at the data. So this is just mayor, right? Not municipal assembly members. And so-called density plot. But basically this light gray here is the Japanese overall population who's 18 or older, the voting age population. And so we all know Japan is an older country, but still the population is relatively evenly distributed. And this black color here is mayor, right? So to me, it always looks like a volcano or something like rising out of the ocean. But mayors in Japan, this really crucial office that makes all sorts of decisions about social spending, is predominantly occupied by people who are age 50 and older, for example. So even though half of Japan's voting age population is under 50, only 10% of mayors are under 50. The average age is 62. And the most common age in Japan for a mayor starting their time in office is 65. Right? Very, very few younger mayors. So we have limited time, and I'm really happy to get into sort of like various aspects of the book project. I'm going to just highlight this key finding for today. But in the book, I do both sort of like quantitative analysis with this data set. I do survey experiments, but I also spend a lot of time in Japan talking to mayors, younger and older mayors. So for this particular part, I talked to 15 mayors. I did not talk to your Takashima-san. I'm sorry, he hadn't been elected when I was doing this fieldwork, but this is a Harvard grad, and at the time, youngest mayor. Somebody just beat him out for the youngest mayor in Japan. So he's now the second youngest, but Ryosuke Takashima. But I interviewed 15 different mayors, and then I spent a lot of time in sort of local child welfare departments like this, often having meetings right next to screaming children. But I was very grateful to these municipal bureaucrats because we sat down with budget, and they helped walk me through the budget, and I would tell them sort of my findings, and they could help sort of catch me on whether or not what I was talking about was actually the way local government worked, actually the directive that they had gotten from the mayor. So again, happy to talk much more about this. I did want to show some quantitative results today. So for this paper and for this particular part of the book, I'm just going to explain the intuition behind this, but I use something that's called a regression discontinuity design. And the goal here for me is basically I was trying to get as close as possible to the causal effect, to what is the real impact of electing a younger mayor on changes in social spending. And the hard part is that I can tell you right now that cities in Japan that have younger mayors spend more on children than cities that do not. That's 100% true. But then you'd immediately think in your mind, yeah, but those cities that elect a younger mayor are just going to be really different from the cities that elect older mayors on all sorts of different dimensions, right? And you're right. They tend to be larger, they tend to have younger populations, they tend to have longer wait lists for public daycare. So the idea of this regression discontinuity design, or RDD, is basically, how about we look at really, really close races between younger and older candidates? This is the intuition. Happy to talk more about it. But we'll look at cities that are basically medium-sized cities on average, right? Challenges with wait lists, challenges with not enough supply at daycare. We're going to look at those cities, and we're going to look at the case where the younger mayor just barely won, and the older mayor just barely won. And on average, those cities are really similar across all sorts of characteristics. They're only differing in what I'm calling sort of the treatment of whether that younger candidate gets a chance to change the direction of the budget. So I'll show you the result. Again, really happy to talk more about this, but let's see, do younger mayors spend more on child welfare than health and welfare? So for anyone who's familiar with an RDD, they know you kind of want to see the plot. So I'll show the plot and then tell you the sort of like the punchline, what's the takeaway finding, right? So here on the left, we have child welfare. On the right, I'm going to show you elderly welfare. The x-axis in each plot is the younger candidate, here defined as a candidate under 50, that lower 10% younger candidates of mayors. What's their vote margin? And so to the left of this line, the y-axis for both is the change in spending. And so again, I know this might be new to many people, but what we look for in RDD is basically at this 0 line, just to the left of this are all those municipal elections where that younger candidate just barely lost. These municipalities get the old mayor, right? And just to the right, they get the younger mayor. And so in RDDs, we want to see what's called like a jump. We want to see if the relationship between the vote margin and the change in spending jumps positively for child welfare. This would mean that just electing that younger mayor leads to a boost in spending. So the punchline is that's what I find, right? So the municipalities in Japan that are really, really similar to the municipalities with older mayors, but just narrowly elect a younger mayor, spend significantly more on child welfare for young families, right? I can show you tables if you want. They're really similar in population, pre-existing welfare spending, pre-existing histories, but just narrowly electing that younger person mayor leads to spending much more on child welfare. And what's interesting is the other one, that the younger mayors don't take from the elderly to give to the young. So younger mayors don't decrease spending on elderly welfare. You're immediately going to ask, where does the money come from? And we can talk a lot more about where it comes from, a variety of sources, cutting down on administrative costs where possible. There's one famous younger mayor who's now the governor of Hokkaido, Naomichi Suzuki. He gets elected mayor of Yubari, and he's looking for money to increase spending on childcare. He fires his vice mayor and uses the salary to increase childcare spending. Others will redirect spending from sort of other like infrastructure areas to childcare. And some take out loans, which is interesting, and we could talk about more because that's also sort of like putting the cost on future generations. But I'm going to skip ahead so we can make sure to get to the rest before we run out of time. So they increase spending on child welfare, but they don't take from the elderly to give to the young. How about those mechanisms I talked about earlier? I'm not going to show you tons of plots. I just want to highlight the main findings. I'm happy to show them to you during the discussion if you're interested. So the first thing emphasized over and over, both in the results and in interviews with mayors, is the importance of that personal experience raising children. So among the mayors those younger mayors who had little kids at home, the effects are even larger. They spend significantly more. Younger mayors without kids still spend more on child welfare than older mayors, but the effects are about twice as large for younger mayors who do have kids. And a lot of young mayors who spoke to me talked about their personal experience with Kaikijido, like long wait lists for public daycare, but this was something they emphasized over and over again during the campaign, that this was something that even drove them or was part of the reason they wanted to run for office. Versus older mayors, it's not like they don't like children, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that, but some of the older mayors that I talked to were much more likely to say to paint the current welfare benefits as already much more generous than what they had when they had young children themselves, and kind of ask why younger generations were complaining, given daycare is like relatively inexpensive in Japan and there's sort of great payments for them. The other thing I find strong support for is the long term, the sort of time horizons, long-term investment. Most of the increase in spending that I find is coming from the greater willingness of younger mayors actually to build more daycare centers to tackle the long wait list for public daycare. And I had to go kind of quickly today, but investing in infrastructure is my sort of proxy for long-term spending. It takes multiple years to build out these centers, and it takes a while for sort of like the returns to come from that. The younger mayors especially build out capacity as compared to sort of more short-term spending, which is kind of just giving out cash payments to voters. They do that as well, but especially this is driven by sort of long-term investment. And then lastly, I don't actually find that there's a sort of interaction between the young mayors and the young voters. So I don't find support for this sort of electoral incentives mechanism as much. Doesn't mean that younger mayors don't care about younger voters, but they seem to do this both in older municipalities and in younger municipalities. In the older municipalities, when they do it, it's all about encouraging more young people to move to their municipality. Right? So they do care about it, but I just mean that it's not contingent on sort of the strength of voters. Okay, so today what I hope to show you is something that can help us understanding democracy in Japan and introduce this sort of new data set for looking at local elections. I think local elections is a really exciting area for anyone interested in sort of doing more work in Japan, because we see this ongoing trend of sort of decentralization, right? Giving municipal governments greater and greater authority over their budgets, in part out of this recognition that population aging and declining birth rates are hitting different areas of Japan differently. And so increasingly, the central government wants to give municipalities greater and greater authority to try things, to experiment, to try and deal with issues like declining birth rates. And so I think this is increasingly an interesting area to work in. And we can talk about, again, 98% of mayors are men, 20% of municipal assemblies in Japan don't have a single woman on them. 60% of municipal assemblies in Japan don't have a single person under 40. Also trying to sort of contribute to elite characteristics and representation in political science by adding age into the conversation and thinking about the ways in which age is sort of different from other social identities. And lastly, the sort of impact on sort of social welfare policy and intergenerational conflict. I'm still thinking about this, but in some ways, my story is maybe good for intergenerational conflict or positive, because I find that the younger mayors don't want to sort of defund the elderly to pay for the young. But when I talk to younger mayors about why, it's unclear how much that is sort of their personal preference as to how much they're being constrained by the immense power of older voters. So I talked to some young mayors who actually had meetings with Shoten Gai, kind of shop owners associations, meetings with these older residents. And they asked the older residents directly, would you mind accepting a little bit less welfare so that we could build a new daycare center? And that meeting went about as well as you could expect. Didn't go very far, and they sort of looked to other areas of the budget. So I'm not sure, how much they're sort of maybe hesitant to pull from the elderly because of the income. This is really about this part of the project, about sort of youth representation and public policy. And with the last kind of minute or two I have, I just wanted to talk about some other parts of the book, including thinking about sort of why Japan has few young candidates, what's part of this story, and maybe consequences for democracy. So in some other fun social survey experiments that I do a lot of stuff that's sort of using AI to manipulate the perceived age of photographs. right? So this is a sort of experiment I do where I sort of manipulate, this is a range of like, how old does the candidate look? And I give people lots of different candidates, and I ask like, which candidate would you support? What do you think's the difference in these mayors? Like what types of issues are they gonna focus on, right? And one of the key takeaways, whether in observational data or in survey experiments, is that it's not just young voters who really like young candidates. Older voters in Japan like young candidates a lot too. Nobody likes gerontocracy. Nobody likes silver democracy. Nobody likes elderly candidates. They're universally sort of panned. And it's interesting to me, they all kind of agree on sort of what younger candidates are focused on, but older voters, maybe because, as I talked about earlier, feel relatively confident that these young mayors are not going to sort of take their benefits away from them. Feel, relatively okay with that. They're okay with sort of electing more young candidates, but younger candidates are universally popular. The other thing on the democracy side that I've been showing lately too is if we do this kind of experiment, not just about a mayor, but sort of showing you like the balance in an assembly, right? So like, let's say an important committee is formed, right, to make decisions about public policy, and we manipulate whether that committee has only older people or like a more age representative, right? Young people and middle-aged people and older people. And increasingly, I'm finding that when you have that age diversity, people generally, including older people, think the committee makes a better decision in the end, has greater trust in the institutions to act on their behalf. And in electoral settings, I also find that all people, especially young people, but including older people, more likely to say that they'll turn out to vote, right, participate in elections, and in observational data as well. So happy to talk more about this side of the project if you're interested. Thanks so much for listening to me today. I'm looking forward to this.
Thanks so much, Charles. That was really fascinating. We're turning it over to Q&A in the audience, and we'll have Professor Miwa start us off with the first question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation with many important questions. This study particularly interests me because I recently published and I read the topic. I found that Japanese people tend to favor younger politicians for their perceived reformist position and tend to withdraw support if these politicians don't meet expectations. With that in mind, while you deny the extra incentive hypothesis, I still wonder if extrinsic motivation might matter along with intrinsic ones, given that policies targeting the declining birth rate can highlight a commitment to reform. And I'm curious about how young mayors come to behave once they become strong incumbents without needing to worry about re-election. So while the study examines short-term changes within 1 year following the election, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on potential long-term impacts, especially in young mayors' second or later terms. That is from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miwa-san. And as Miwa-san was saying, he has this wonderful new paper out about sort of voter opinions about younger candidates as well, and finds that one reason why maybe voters in Japan might support younger candidates is because they infer younger candidates are going to be more populist, for example. I have sort of like a related finding to Miwa-san's thing, which is that in the sort of survey experiments we've been doing, I find that voters, younger and older, tend to think younger candidates are going to be less corrupt and will focus on fighting corruption more. Now, there's plenty of stories in Japan where I'm not trying to paint younger candidates as like, some universally good and have no downsides whatsoever. And so there's certainly stories in Japan of younger candidates as well engaging in corruption. But I think especially in this moment, there's definitely, I believe the reform story you're saying. I do think voters believe younger candidates might do something differently, might be less entrenched, less sort of like, tied to special interests. And so they at least believe that they're going to focus on sort of fighting corruption more. And then the other part you asked about was as these mayors like kind of stay in office longer, and there's really high incumbency rates among mayors in Japan. And so maybe the story I'm telling is sort of when they first get to office, but after they're sort of safe, do they still behave the same way? It's a good question. I don't have like a really long time series to be able to look at it with data as much. But I also wondered when you asked the question about whether or not this might free the younger voters from being as concerned about older voters. Right? If they're sort of more safe, they could behave, it could be a good test to sort of see whether they continue to focus on these issues. So I'll think about it more, but thank you so much for the question.
Please.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering if you've done any comparison with the United States. I'm really interested in kind of opposite of what you were talking about and why there's not more focus in Congress on issues related to long-term care and caregiving and how we're not seeing a lot of progress in this realm. So it seems like in Japan, the premise was that with the older age skewing of elected officials, that there's more focus on these issues, but it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the case in the US. And I'm curious if your research has shown like why that might be, or like what's different about Japan.
I've just sort of recently started to partner with some kind of more Americanists, right, more American politics focused people to sort of explore these types of topics in the US. In Japan, it seemed like for me, right from the beginning of this project, I was always focused on sort of declining birth rates and population aging, because that is just, the most salient issue, like in domestic politics, and it's so perfectly lined up with age. But when I talk in like political science settings and among Americanists, the immediate issue they think about instead is climate change.
Yeah.
And so I haven't done as much on the welfare issues in the US on that connection. I've done instead about climate change and sort of similar perceptions. This is true in Japan too. I also find it in the survey experiment about sort of expecting younger candidates to focus more on climate change, or maybe I found that younger candidates are motivated to talk about climate change issues. So I've sort of done that. And then the only other thing I've done, I can kind of speak to it, is that the experiment I was talking about sort of manipulating the age diversity of committees. We also did that in the US and found very similar things where people in the US also, including older people in the US, nobody likes gerontocracy, right? People like age diversity and think it matters. And it's interesting to me how it can even change the person's perception of whether or not, say, a committee reached the right decision on certain policy issues. So sorry, I don't have like a more definitive answer to what you're asking about, but I'd very much like to test it and sort of partner with people to ask, to sort of explore it more in other cases.
Okay. Go ahead. Yes.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about the allocation of money? Because it's here in the United States, so much power resides in the party structure. Is the same thing true in Japan?
Yes. So I had to.
I mean, the cities you said are different, but how much different?
Yeah. So normally I give this as like a 45-minute talk, and about the 15 minutes I cut out or so, a lot of it was about details about how budgets work in Japan and about municipal government spending. So what I will say is that, absolutely your story is true, and a lot of these municipalities are very reliant on transfers from the central government to their functioning. In this particular study, I'm exploiting a nice fact, which is that although there wasn't great data on local elections in Japan, those municipal budgets are very, very, very detailed and split into sort of different categories. And they will actually sort of split out what type of funding is dictated by the national government according to formulas. So people like who know Japanese politics will know like Jidou Teate or Kodomo Teate, right? Technically, that money is administered by local governments, but they have limited say. They can add on top of it, but they can't change the sort of baseline level. And so what I'm actually doing here is I'm only looking at a category of spending, which is discretionary spending. I'm only looking at the spending where the mayor has the most influence. And I'm actually leaving out what you're talking about, where it's sort of determined by other areas. And that's kind of like my like placebo test, in a sense, to show that it doesn't affect those levels, and that's not the story. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Hi, this is really interesting. I have one very actual question and then another bigger question. When you say cities, are you talking about sheet and not like the other types of municipalities, towns and villages? Was it just municipal, like?
So I'm sorry, I should be clearer in my language. So it's all municipalities.
Okay.
But practically, when we're talking about the type of municipality where that's in, say, the quantitative analysis, where you have close elections between younger and older candidates, that's mostly cities, about 80 to 100,000 people. That's like the sweet spot. Some towns. I think no villages. I think there's 183 villages in Japan, and I don't think maybe one or two of them have a younger mayor, but if they do, it wasn't like a close election. But in the data set, all are included, including the special wards like I've talked about.
So my more substantive question is about the previous careers that get people elected mayor. I suppose that if you looked at MPs who were under 40, a certain large percentage are the children or grandchildren of political families. But maybe with mayors, it's not so much. And so I can imagine older first-time mayors having spent a lot of time in municipal governments and rising through the ranks to Joyaku, the vice mayor, and then getting elected mayor. Whereas the younger guys, all guys, I guess, are coming in from the outside, can have a more of a maverick kind of imagery that might spread to other policies, including child welfare.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So your story is correct and very much true, and it's also the impression locally. So a lot of people, for instance, think that the older mayors, say come up through the municipal government and kind of wait their turn to run for mayor, and that's why they run for office at 62 or sort of 65 is the retirement age. By comparison, the image of younger mayors is sometimes I've heard there's like kind of almost like hometown heroes. They go off and they join the national bureaucracy, and then they like come back and bring that knowledge back. Or Takashima-san, right, comes to Harvard and comes home. Actually, there's a lot more diversity among younger candidates. I know we hear that story often, but that while it's true, there's quite a lot of different pathways, and in some ways, it's almost more exception than the rule. There aren't. I actually haven't found a lot of younger candidates are from the political families, and certainly not at the same. There's not the same Nisei Sanseikin as at the national level. There's much more variation. And I try to sort of look to get at the point you're asking is basically I try to sort of control for background and sort of see if we still see this age effect. And I do still find that younger mayors do it even if they sort of had a similar career background as the older mayors. So to the extent I had data to look at it, I didn't think that it was sort of only the maverick status. But to Miwa-san's point too, I do think that's like an important part of like the story, in the sense that like among the voters, I think that they, expect these candidates to sort of do something different, try something different. It's a pretty dire situation in a lot of like these municipalities in terms of like being on basically the brink of extinction, right? This worry that they're going to disappear altogether. And so I think that, and especially together with this trend of giving the local governments sort of greater autonomy, there's sort of a change in a lot of voters' minds that it's not just like the previous story was that what voters cared about most in the mayor's office was how close they are to Tokyo, right? You want a mayor, like an older mayor who has deep ties to Tokyo to sort of bring home the money. But as those channels have started to dry up more and more, I think there's like more voter willingness and desire to sort of go with more matter.
Koichi Nakano, visiting scholar at the US-Japan program. Thank you for your talk. I was trying to figure out whether this was a petty point or important one, but more like a comment just to throw in. In terms of concepts, I think child welfare is fine in terms of shorthanded way of saying what is it that you're talking about, but there is this question, what you're counting, and I think it may be a slip of a tongue, but you also mentioned the Japanese word jidofukushi. The jidofukushi is, of course, literal translation of child welfare, but it has very specific meaning in Japanese, and it's more about child protection from abuse and child labor and things. And so I think, generally the Japanese term that probably you have in mind is like kodomo kosodatte shien, that kind of thing. And, I think in terms of what you're counting and what you're looking at, the conceptual clarity might be important. And a related point is also about the expression silver democracy. I'm guessing this may be a Japanese word in origin that is being sort of, shiruba minshu shugi. And I think in my understanding, I might be wrong, but in my understanding, shiruba minshu shugi often means usually different things. And it's more to do with elderly voters who, of course, constitute a great chunk of the Japanese voters acting selfishly to their own interest, so voting for themselves, increasing their own spending rather than, at the expense of the youth. That's what's implied, I think. And you're not talking about that. I think you're talking more about the politicians, and you're also not necessarily buying into this idea of intergenerational conflict. So
yeah, so I think two things. So absolutely, and it was sort of a slip of the tongue to say jidofukushi. I know absolutely what you're talking about. And likewise to the other question, the nice thing about municipal budgets is that I can separate out spending that is for the welfare of children, say children who are no longer cared for by their parents, for example, which is an absolutely crucial part of the overall child welfare story. Within the child welfare budget, includes both that type of like geography and like what you're saying, the sort of child payment. So I am separating them out. And I used a sort of like umbrella term, it's a part because the budget kind of like lays it under an umbrella term, but I understand that in people's popular conception, like that's what you're thinking about. Likewise, I guess with silver democracy, I recognize that was sort of like the popular use of the term, and I'm kind of trying to repurpose it to think about it in a different way, and not only thinking about, say, the role of young people as voters, or not only thinking about older voters, but also thinking about kind of like gerontocracy as well. But in the book, I sort of grapple with more with this like distinction and how people think about it. But it is true that I'm using a term that most people will think about as sort of meaning like a greedy older people, or that kind of intergenerational conflict. And I'm kind of, that's exactly the conception I'm sort of trying to argue against, if it makes sense, to kind of repurpose it.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a PhD candidate here. First, just briefly, I want to highlight that this is also, I think, like a big contribution to the social investment literature and comparative political economy. Should pay more attention to Japan, so really great. I wanted to ask a question about partisanship, which, as you said, it's not explicitly partisan, these elections, right? So I'm curious, is there sort of like a implicit selection of parties of candidates, given how strongly party organizations control sort of legislative elections up and down the ballot? And second, I wanted to ask like whether you've looked at like these mayors' careers before and after mayorship to get a sense of that sort of implied partisanship, and whether there's any like conditional effect, and just generally your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the larger data set, like the 200,000 data set, I have not been successful in fully tracing like the partisanship of all people. For those who like know Japanese local politics, it can be interesting phenomenon where parties that compete against each other at the national level join together and jointly back the same candidate in local elections, like even the LDP and CDPJ. But the LDP, I mean, a lot of these candidates have ties to the LDP. And the tricky part is that in the mayor's election, they won't run on the party label, but they might receive some support from the party. So for the subset of mayor's elections that are really close between younger and older candidates, for that subset group, which is like the focus of the RDD and this particular part, I have lots of information about those candidates. And so actually I found that I tried to trace back what they were doing before. Were they in the municipal assembly? Did they ever do something where they had to sort of reveal their partisan preferences? I actually didn't find any differences among, similar levels of LDP connection. And so I also tried to look at sort of LDP versus non-LDP. Was there some kind of like interaction? I didn't find it, but it is hard, and it's noticeably, it's just difficult at the local level to sort of fully track connections. But I did everything I could to sort of see like how strong are these people's connections to the LDP. Thank you.
Sure, Charlie, thank you for sharing your work. I think you did a great job in kind of situating contemporary Japan to answer your research questions. Given that the childcare is such an emerging issue in the local politics in particular, but that makes me wonder to what extent your findings, let's say, are kind of universal across time. So because your data covers like over 20 years, I guess, like 2000 to 2020. Then back in 2000, I was still in like elementary school. Probably I don't remember quite well.
Yeah.
But I think childcare was not really such a big issue in the local.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. The advantage of my data and my analysis is more like geographic coverage.
Sure.
Right. So my advantage is I don't have like so many years, but I have like all candidates, all elections. So that's great. But I don't have sort of a really long time span to sort of tease out like age period cohort effects, for example, or to tell you like generational differences. I guess in my view, to some degree, that's sort of like a generalizability sort of testing, in the sense of like, I hope future work can kind of test whether this, seems to matter in other settings. I will say, as you know from me, because you've seen past projects, I've been doing this a long time. And so thankfully, a lot of people have seen my talk and then run it in their own country. And so I've actually seen about 5 or 6 papers in different countries, essentially taking my research design now and doing it exactly in their country. And actually, they find pretty similar. So I've seen positive results in Brazil, both for like sort of childcare and then also for climate change in Bulgaria, in South Korea. And in Sweden. Okay. So I think there is something that may, translate to other cases. I think this is like a really new area. So we need, like, this is just sort of establishing, can we find an effect? Can the age of a politician like matter for the actual distribution of government resources? That's sort of a starting point. And now I think we need a lot more work to sort of condition these findings much more, and sort of like under what conditions are younger, politicians able to do this more and more. So thank you for the question.
Hi, and my name is Marian Mura. I'm a visiting scholar at Weizsäcker Institute. Thank you for your presentation. And your graph was really fascinating that you clearly show that there is a correlation between age and also the spending patterns. And the cutting point seems to be that was 50 years old.
Yes.
I wonder why you put that 50 years old cutting point. And I'm sure that you did a lot of research, and then and also if you include some other countries. In Japan, such an aging society, so 50 is still young, right? 40 is like a baby, right?
No, it's true.
But in other countries, maybe 50 and 40 is not young anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
So why is the 50
Yeah.
important? And could you
that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the median age in Japan is 45. If I did this project in Nigeria, the median age is 18. Right? So it's, and actually a lot of like the global South countries, for example, have even worse, like, youth underrepresentation, like very, very few young people in office, despite the population being incredibly young. So I do think that it's sort of context dependent to a degree. I will also say, having given this, variations of this talk before, I often find that I personally make people feel good or offend people based on where like people come after me afterwards, and they're very 48-year-olds are really happy that I called them young, and 52-year-olds are pissed. And so it's fun. So the long story short is that I chose 50 because it was the age of the median voter during this year. So like the average age of voters, that was one reason. 10% of mayors are under 50. And so it's hard, just in the Japanese setting, it's hard for me to push the age much lower than 50, just practically. There aren't a lot of 35-year-old mayors, for example. So that's practically the reason. But then basically in the book and in papers based on this, I try to show like how the effect changes to pretty much any other way you could think about, like conceptualizing the cut point. I also, sometimes people ask me, how do you know this effect isn't driven by 49-year-olds narrowly beating out 51-year-olds? But actually, like in the Japan setting, when you do a cut at 50, the average age gap between these candidates in my sample is 20 years. So, if I separate out the close in age lines, it doesn't change the effects. So I try to think about every other way, but if other people have other ideas, I'm always getting feedback on like what's young and what's not. In this setting, this is what made sense to me.
Susan Farg, I'm the department, retired. Your young people seem like dream candidates, that you elect a young mayor and you get people who care about children and spend more on social measures for children. And at the same time, they don't cut spending for the elderly. So why aren't there more young mayors?
So I highlighted sort of like one aspect, but one thing I'll say is I highlighted the impact of the young mayors on the social welfare budget. So they didn't, and I highlighted how they didn't sort of take from the elderly to get to the young, but there's no free lunch, right? So that money has to come from somewhere. And so they do cut from like administrative costs to the government. There's a cost there, and they're much more likely to take on debt, for example, to fund that investment. And so depending on your conception of sort of like, good or bad, I don't want to suggest they don't come with a cost. But to your question, which is about why don't we see more young candidates, especially since voters like them, it's pretty clear that Japan, especially at the national level, but at local level as well, elections are really, like in Japan, really heavily put a great premium on experience. And so experience, like a lot of the elections are very like individual candidate focused elections. And so the candidates that tend to do well are those who have sort of like deep, like local ties, like to the community, or sort of these networks, or they have sort of personal finances. It's expensive to run in like many of these elections. And all of these factors are ones that make it like very challenging because people tend to accumulate resources like this as they get older. And so it's hard for young people to sort of compete. And to David's earlier question too, it's also why at the national level, like you don't see a lot of young candidates, and the only young candidates you do see are they're not really representative more generally because they tend to come from sort of generational pathways that give them access to these resources. So I think that's part of the story, resource one. Another one I think is disengaged young people from politics and sort of low like political ambition. We could talk about sort of, educational environment in Japan that doesn't talk a lot about like politics in high school, and people don't get socialized into politics until an older age. But the last thing I'll say is what I'm actually focused on, what I find really interesting is that when I talk to a lot of young people who are kind of on the cusp of running for office, so they're not people like in high school, but they're the ones who are sort of interning, or they were really interested in running for office, they're considering it, but they haven't yet taken the plunge. And for them, what I often hear about their biggest concern is actually like the rigidity of the labor market. And they're very concerned that basically if they skip, so either they don't want to skip job hunting to run for office because they think it will forever hurt their earning potential, or if they did job hunting and they have a job at like Mitsubishi Heavy or Toyota, they don't want to leave office to run for, they don't want to leave their job to run for office because they're basically ruining their future career forever. And so actually in the most recent local election, and something I'm studying right now, there have been experiments being done by companies with sort of like candidate leave systems, right? Allowing candidates to take a break from their job to run for local office and protecting their job while they run so that they can serve like a term in government and then come back. But I think there's opportunities for sort of like more creative solutions of how to like address what's keeping young people from running for office.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Could you talk a little bit about what constitutes the elderly spending? So the argument about lack of intergenerational redistribution, my superficial understanding of the welfare state is that I would have guessed that mayors have less policy discretion because it's things like healthcare and so on. So could you just talk about that aspect?
Yeah, so it is true. So there's, just like there's the Olumoteate or like the national level payments for children that they have no control over, local governments have no control over the national pension system or paid out by like national healthcare. But they actually do spend a fair amount of money at the local level, both in subsidizing certain services for the elderly. I talked to like some municipalities actually give money to people when they hit certain milestone birthdays, for example. So like hitting 65, 70, the local government gives you money to sort of congratulate you on hitting that. That's maybe a funny example, but there's all sorts of services that are provided by the municipality for older people. And then as well, municipalities do pay into running some of the elder care centers. Not as much as prefectural governments, but they do contribute there. But it's both sort of direct payments. And in fact, cutting that monthly birthday thing, I say that because that mayor I showed you, I think Shuhei Asuma, I believe he cut that program. That was one of the few examples I found of sort of cutting something. It was very unpopular, but he found that as one source of sort of money. But it's interesting to sort of see where people try to find the budget.
We're just about at time, but two questions came in from online, so I'm gonna give them both to you at the same time. So the first one from Scott Rooney is there an effect for very old politicians who are grandparents? And then the second one is if the rare number of young politicians in Japan has to do with traditional Japanese social norms related to Confucian norms of filial piety, which emphasize the importance of respect and concern for elders. And does that have an influence on the way that it would be applied to politics, perhaps influencing the preference for more experienced older leaders?
Yeah, so I'll take those in first. So the second one, when I started, I thought Japanese voters would be much more hesitant toward electing young people as mayor in particular. Because I don't know, like age-based hierarchies exist in like all organizations in Japan, in the workplace, in politics. It's just sort of ever present. And there's very few situations where a young person is in position of authority over an older person. And so I thought that Japan would be like most hesitant. But if we looked at sort of like cross-national surveys, for example, Japan is actually the reverse. It's the most supportive of young candidates and the most desiring to see like more young people run for office to the extent we have work. So I found that like that's interesting. It was sort of counter to what I initially expected. And then the other one was about an effect of older mayors. So I don't have it here, but yes, I did at one point look at like the effect of electing a mayor 70 and older on sort of social spending. And I didn't find that they increased spending on elderly welfare, but I did find that they decrease investment and increase short-term spending. So like they were more focused on sort of like the shorter term. I thought that was interesting. I would love to do the grandparent effect that was asked about, but it was honestly such a pain to track whether mayors have children or not, or how old their children are, that the question about asking whether they have grandchildren, it's not possible. But the 70-year-old plus, I did find that they were more likely to focus on sort of like what could they immediately do within sort of like their final, which was interesting because I thought maybe they would be also kind of like legacy focused or sort of long-term thinking. Thank you.
Well, please join me and thank you.